Hello. Uh, I'm here by the good grace and the love and kindness of Yoga International. Thank you guys for having me and for continuing to give me a platform and an opportunity to share what it is that I love. And thank you to all of you around the world for engaging in my teaching and your curiosity to go one or two or maybe like 5-10 steps deeper into the rabbit hole of what it is we're all about here. You know, I made the post about this training, and I got a couple people that messaged me and said, "Oh, you know, I never plan my sequences. I just unroll the mat and see what happens and let spirit move me." And I thought, that's really wonderful. I do that too. And also, that doesn't sound like a yoga nerd to me. For all you yoga nerds, which I assume you are if you're here, that love to plan and love to craft and love to develop and kind of dig into the various choices that we have at our disposal as yoga teachers, you've come to the right place. And like perhaps we'll do another training in the future about kind of organic, free-flowing, fluid movement practices. But for this weekend, I'll be activating my Virgo mind as much as possible to share with you really what it is that I do, the process that I undergo. All right, so the way that this course is going to function, if you haven't already kind of gotten a sense of the protocol here, is we're going to be diving into several of the classes that I have on the Yoga International platform. And I've chosen these classes specifically because I think that they represent a pretty diverse approach to different sequencing styles. So we have a class that kind of focuses a bit more on kind of a particular movement that gets likewise regressed and progressed to find greater accessibility in our body. There's a practice that sort of leverages a particular theme and explores some somatic movements. We have a vinyasa class that works up towards a peak pose, and then one of the sessions from the isometric program. So because we only have 2 hours each day together live, my hope, my expectation is that you are all able to take the class before we meet live, and then we'll use the hours that we have together to sort of debrief the class. And I'll be sharing with you kind of the principles and the techniques and the questions that I sort of asked of myself that led to the creation of that particular sequence. So I will assume there'll be some degree of clarity and confusion around that process, at least for this first session. My hope, again, is that at least most of you on this on the live stream today were able to take session 1, which is the single leg balance transition, the single leg stability class, because that's what we're going to be diving into today. So go ahead and raise your hand if you took that class, if you have experienced that class already in your body. Okay, sweet. And if you have not, you know, as is true of kind of the way that we learn, sometimes it's best to kind of have the experiential piece first, and then we can unpack what it is that just happened. Other times we'll kind of get the theory in our mind and our awareness, and then we'll put it in our tissues as experience. So both strategies can work. I find that if we go the latter, you might be a little kind of confused until you have a chance to kind of embody it. And if that's the case, then, you know, as Serena mentioned, you're going to have access to these recordings. So we will kind of save Q&A for the end of each session. There's a lot that I want to share with you guys. So I'm going to be going through the information relatively quickly, and it's inevitable that you will find yourself experiencing some degree of confusion. One of my favorite quotes, I think I first heard this from Leslie Kaminoff, where he says, "Confusion is the first step towards clarity." So if you've never studied with me before, my general approach to learning is to ask more questions than it is that I provide distinct answers, because questions can ensure that you continue to learn well into the future, whereas sort of concrete answers sort of represent a finite approach to learn. Oh, Deskachar. Well, Deskachar was Kamenov's teacher. Yeah, so we're going to sort of take an inquisitive approach to sequencing. The principles that I'll be sharing with you are not rules necessarily to follow, but really guidelines and questions to stoke your own creativity that you can likewise leverage into intelligent and creative sequences. So with that said, what I would love to hear, I'm seeing some of you guys write this already, I would love to spend a little bit of time hearing some of your, well, don't write anything yet, but I want to hear some of your feedback from the class that you took. And when I say feedback, I really mean that to invite an articulation of your experience. So someone here said it was a challenging and great class. The kind of feedback that I'm interested in are things like, you know, what did you learn in taking the class? What did you like about the class? If you say it was a great class, what for you made it a great class? What were some of your takeaways from experiencing the class? If, you know, perhaps as it relates to your own journey as a teacher or your own understanding of the poses or the movements that we explored. If you do have specific questions about the sequence, I'll just ask that you write those down, and as we go through the several hours that are ahead, write down your questions and I will do my best to address them at the end. Okay, so any feedback that you have from the class and how it kind of landed in your mind and in your body, let's share. I've never before received feedback from 150 people at once, so bear with me here. I loved how pushing the hip under the pelvis to open up the hip into half moon. Okay, I'm gonna switch off of my headset. Apparently it's not doing what it needs to do. Let's do this. Okay, can you guys hear me? I'm on my computer audio now here. Made me surprisingly aware of how my standing leg, outer hip moved the top leg. I heard that this is a dangerous transition. Yeah, I received some clarity on how to make it safe. The hips feel alive. Liked going slower to really process the understanding. Helped put some technical words into experience. While supine, trying to isolate a single hip and move through the hip movements was more challenging than standing. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Sometimes when we regress a movement and put it in a more supported position, you can experience things that you might not otherwise experience in the progressed form. And that's one of the reasons that we, at least that I choose to do that. I love the progression that all came together. Great to break down the movements. Leading with the hip was a helpful cue. The block on the sacrum made me realize how much I open my hips. I feel like my glutes feel tight right now from that practice. Yeah, it was definitely a pretty heavily loaded practice for the glute muscles. So it's no surprise if you're still experiencing some reverberating feedback. Okay. I won't be able to read all these, of course. That would take a few hours. Something I truly love is the visual internal connection of wrapping the hip particularly. Cool. I like starting on the floor and progressing to standing. My hips also felt really good after that class. I was surprised. I still don't know if it would cue those transitions in a typical vinyasa practice because slowing it down, yeah, is what seemed to help. Okay, sweet. Well, thank you for sharing. And all of that, like, to me, that translates as sort of mission accomplished, in that, like, that's, you know, whatever your experience is what it is. It's not that I'm necessarily going for you to have that experience, but there are definite learning outcomes that I want to make clear in a class like this. And it sounds like for at least a good number of you, those outcomes were achieved. So essentially this class was born out of, and I believe I mentioned this in the class itself, but this class was born, let me just pause and say, is the sound better with me not on the headset now? You can just thumbs up me if that's the case. Okay, cool, got it. The only downside to being on my computer is you're likely to hear more traffic and LA soundtracks, but so it goes. Right now we're good. This class was really born out of something that I've heard a lot over the years. You know, I've been a part of many different teacher training programs and workshops on sequencing, and I've taught at a lot of different studios. And a lot of studios will sort of give you the guidelines of, let's say, like do's and don'ts, or the rules of what you can do at the studio, or poses, movements, transitions that are off the table versus ones that are allowed. And you know, if I'm teaching at a studio that has very clear terms or very clear sentiments on what they want or don't want, I'm happy to honor those. But just who I am naturally as a person, if somebody says, don't ever do that, it's dangerous, you're going to hurt yourself, then that for me stimulates more questions. Like, well, why is that the case? And how might I do it successfully if I want to do it? So I'd rather open up my options as a teacher as opposed to limit my options. And usually in the pursuit of opening up my options, it means that I have to ask more questions and learn more so that I can make likewise more informed decisions. So maybe raise your hand if you've heard this before, that the transition from Virabhadrasana 3 to Ardha Chandrasana, or Ardha Chandrasana to Virabhadrasana 3 is an unsafe transition, or is something that should be avoided in, say, a vinyasa class. Okay, yeah, so I'm not alone. I'm not alone in that. It's not that it's beyond the scope of this training, but we could certainly dive into why that might be the case, just in terms of the structures of the hip. I don't necessarily disagree with that sentiment. It's a pretty complex movement that requires quite a lot of lateral hip stability and coordination to kind of change your relationship to gravity while standing on one leg with your body weight distributed across a pretty long lever, right? Virabhadrasana 3, arms are overhead, the back leg is straight, and we're sort of rolling and turning over the bottom hip. And for all those reasons, I wouldn't say it's dangerous, but if you've never invested in the skill of learning how to, let's say, adduct and abduct your hip in the horizontal plane, which is what this is, while balancing on one leg with your body weight lengthened as it is, that's hard. Right, that's difficult to do well. And as a result, if the movement is not kind of adequately mapped and developed, oftentimes we end up with compensation patterns that could produce some wear and tear on some of the structures in the hip. Okay, so I both agree with that sentiment, and I also have, you know, as evidenced by this class, more questions to ask about how we might actually develop that skill in our students. Okay. So, you know, as someone mentioned in the feedback, I think that the sentiment to avoid that transition may be wise relative to a vinyasa class, right? So in a vinyasa class, we might not necessarily be teaching or mapping or developing the skill of being able to do that transition. It might be more of sort of a choreographed feature of the class to kind of get us from one position to the next. So featuring a movement in a vinyasa sequence is different for me than really investing in developing the skill of a movement. So what we're going to look at today is not necessarily kind of vinyasa sequencing, of course, of how you might thread that movement into a class, but really say, if that is something that you want to feature in your vinyasa class, or if that's something that a student has a difficult time doing, instead of just saying, don't ever do it, like, how might you help somebody, or how might you create an opportunity of learning, of strength building, of skill building, where somebody could therefore develop that skill so it isn't off the table, but it's something that they can do. Okay, so that's really where this class was born from. You know, I sort of had in mind a series of classes that sort of took controversial transitions or controversial movements and really
explored how to do them safely, how to do them successfully, and how to do them skillfully. So that leads into really what we're going to be discussing today, which is this concept of movement regression and movement progression. And I got to give a shout out there. I give her a shout out like everywhere I go in the world, because this information has been so pivotal to my understanding of human movement and of teaching and of exercise science. So shout out to Trina Altman, who I know is out there. I've seen her name pop up a few times, because she's the first teacher that I actually learned this from. She had a webinar, I believe, that I took a few years ago called Regress to Progress, and she outlined many of these principles and these theories that pull on exercise science principles and biomechanics to really give me the language of how it is that we actually go about, or how we can go about taking movements and making them more challenging, or taking movements and making them less challenging. So we could talk quite a lot about what it means to regress and progress, how that connects with our developmental movements through life, how that might connect with other systems of strength training and mobility and movement. But in the interest of time, in the interest of simplicity, let's just identify a movement progression as anything that we do to make something, oh my God, the webinar was life-changing. Anything that we do to make our movements more difficult, and a regression is anything that we do to make a movement less difficult or more accessible. Okay, so as I look at the movement from Virabhadrasana 3 to Ardha Chandrasana and vice versa, and I think about kind of the aspects of that transition relative to how that movement could be mapped, it's a pretty progressed endeavor, right, as sort of a baseline. Now, of course, we could make that even more challenging. So we could like stand on a block and try to do it, or we could stand on an uneven surface and try to do it. We could do it more times. We could do it more quickly. We could do it with ankle weights on, right? There's ways that we could make that movement even more difficult. We could do it holding onto a kettlebell or something. But as evidenced by the class that we all experience, or that most of you experience, there's also many ways that we can make that movement more accessible. Okay, so that's what we're going to dive into. There's sort of three parts to our work today. I want to kind of give an overview of different techniques and strategies that you can use to regress and likewise progress your movements, many of which you experienced in the class. So we're just going to give some language to them. And then we're going to go through some of the worksheets that I created for you guys that you can use to apply these principles to whatever movement or whatever pose is of interest to you. Sound good? Show of hands, who has studied this work before? Who's familiar with regression and progression? If you've worked with me, if you've worked with Trina, you've no doubt experienced this. Okay, cool. And you know, the reason that I chose this class and the reason that we're going to do this first is because, you know, anything that you might consider like a modification of a pose, or you know, variation of a pose, or even poses that might live within a similar family but have different names. You know, once you have kind of the language of regression and progression, it's a little, at least for me, it creates consistency and integration amongst various styles of movement, where what we're doing on a mat and calling a yoga pose might have an application to, say, weight training, or might have an application to dance or some other form of movements. So it kind of opens up the spectrum of connectivity for me in learning how to develop my own drills, my own movements, and also create a sequence that makes sense in terms of kind of the mapping of a particular skill. Okay, so once you understand this, kind of the rules of sequencing of like what goes before this, or kind of how to take someone from A to B, become a little bit less mystifying. Certainly it's been the case for me. And that's what we'll leverage into the worksheets. I was taught accessibility, different name, same game. Yeah, so you'll hear, you know, I've studied this. Oh, interesting. Okay, I'm told that when you guys raise your hands, you can't see how many people are raising your hands, just me. I think I just saw like 30 or 40 hands go up for that last question. So yeah, I have heard many different names used for some of these principles. you know, what's in a name, depending on the modality that you're in, you'll hear different names. And I try to use a couple different names in the worksheet. So if there's confusion there, it may just very well be that we're referencing the same thing. I'll try to kind of pull those threads together for you. Okay. Out of curiosity. Right now I see 152 of you guys in this particular session. So here's where we get to nerd out. Regress and progress. So I'm going to present this much like I would in a live training. Someone asked about the worksheets. When you go into the course, there are the PDFs for each course or each session that are identified there that you can access. You don't need to pull up the worksheets quite yet. You don't need to print them out. I'm going to kind of walk you through the worksheets and how to use them. And then it'll sort of be on your own to work with them. And then if you have questions from there, we can go back to the drawing board, so to speak. Okay, now, when I look at my screen, this is reversed. I'm assuming that you guys can see this not in its mirrored form, but in its correct form. A big feature of training with me is learning how to decipher my sometimes my handwriting is regressed and sometimes it's quite progressed. So we'll see what it is today. But some of the techniques that I used in this particular class as it relates to movement regression and progression, the first of which that I'll identify is as it relates to position. Okay, and some of you guys referenced this in your feedback, right? That it was interesting or it felt clarifying in some way or helpful in some way to take the movement Warrior 3 to Ardha Chandrasana and to experience it on our backs, okay? So back here we have an example of a regressed, just like, yeah, unprofessional. So based on our position relative to gravity and relative to the floor, we can take movements and experience them in different ways and perhaps find greater accessibility of the positioning. Okay, so the positions, kind of going from a more regress to a progress position, yeah, exactly, also sort of mirror or reflect the progression that we move through in our developmental progression, right? From the floor up to our hands and knees to a seated position to a standing position, right? So as infants learning how to kind of bring our body online, we move from a more regressed position on the floor to a more progressed position, upright. And we'll explore that in some future classes as well. So the regress to progress positions that this class followed, okay, started with what I'll call a supported position. So a supported position could also be a position that's like on the floor, okay, or which could be either supine or prone, right? So the more of our body that's being supported by the floor, essentially, the less we have to do to support ourselves. The floor is supporting us. Okay, so as adults that are capable of standing upright, we can make the choice to regress, to go down onto the floor, to experience our movements in a different way. Of course, as a newborn, you don't have that choice, right? You have to actually develop the strength and the ability to get yourself up off the floor. So a supported position would be the most regressed position, supported by, in this instance, the floor. Okay, the next position that we sort of progress from, both in our development and in this class, is from a supported position to a crawling position. Sometimes we reference crawling as a quadruped position. Okay, so hands and knees are tabletop. You can only see half the board. You guys able to see this? Okay. So yes. Yeah, you can move your chat boxes aside to see what's going on here. Okay. So a crawling position would be the next kind of progress position from the floor. Sometimes we call that quadruped or tabletop. You know, if we were to kind of expand that category and create like progressions within the crawling category, we lifted our knees off the floor, more of a plank position, or even if we progressed the range of motion in our shoulders and in our knees and went into something like downward facing dog, In all instances, these would be a variation of a crawling position. Okay. Now, in this particular class, we didn't quite go into the next category of positional progressions, but I'm going to put it down anyway because were this a longer class and we had more time to explore, perhaps we would have. And that would be a seated position and potentially a kneeling position. Okay, so essentially, when we go from crawling to seated or kneeling, we lift our hands off the floor and now we're supporting ourselves with just our legs. And this starts to kind of change our orientation potentially to gravity, where instead of being horizontal, now we're bringing ourselves vertical, which provides kind of the next step in our progression to a standing position. Okay. So standing upright on two legs would be a progression relative to these various positions. And then within standing, we have sort of different options and different ways that we can further progress that skill, right? So standing on two legs is going to give us more stability versus, like, if I say balancing, lifting one leg off the floor, standing on one leg, that's going to be a more progressed position relative to standing. The last positional progression that I choose to put in this this sequence, rather not in this sequence, but in this organization of progression, is relative to what a lot of us as yoga practitioners endeavor to do, and that is inverting. In other words, standing on our hands. Okay, now that's sort of, to me, what makes the endeavor of the yogi somewhat interesting, right? Like, once we've figured out how to stand on two legs, stand on one leg, to walk, to jump, right, to move around, then we say, like, let's keep going. Let's keep participating in our evolution, and let's figure out how to stand on our hands, or stand on one hand, or balance on our arms. So it can kind of crossfade into different categories depending on the shape, but essentially inverting would represent for me kind of the furthest arc of movement progression. Okay. Now, this particular class that we all took makes use of the supported position. We do some crawling work, not so much in the seated kneeling category, but then in the standing and balancing position. Okay. So in the associated worksheet, you'll see we have these different categories listed, and then further ideas for how you can progress and regress movements in this particular, or in these particular categories. Another technique that I explore quite a lot in this sequence, there off the board, is the idea of lever length. And essentially, lever length refers to how far away from the focal joint, okay, in the case of this class, it's going to be your hip joint, how far away from that joint the weight is distributed. Explain crawling. Yeah, hands and knees, right? So a quadruped position on hands and knees. We can dive a little bit deeper into that towards the end of the session if need be. But in this class, we spend, at least there's 2 drills that we do on hands and knees, some hip circumductions, some hip rotations from a quadruped position, and then we do it in downward facing dog, a progression of that. So for example, if I go from a crawling position or a quadruped position, and I choose to lengthen the lever of my legs, that would take me into sort of a downward facing dog type position. And likewise, if I'm in a crawling position and I shorten the lever of my arms, that would put me into a crawling position on my forearms. So essentially the lever refers to how far away from the joint the weight is distributed, right? My arm weighs what it weighs, but if I make my arm longer, right, then the amount of force that my arm is exhibiting on my shoulder increases, and therefore the amount of stability that my shoulder needs to recruit increases as well. You can imagine, like, if you had a bolt and you attached a wrench to that bolt, if there was a very small little arm there, you'd have to work pretty hard to loosen the bolt. The longer the lever, the less force is needed to exhibit more force on the bolt. So the longer the lever, the more progressed So in a regress situation, a shorter lever and a longer lever is going to likewise regress or progress our movements. Okay, so if you think back on the class that we took, for the most part, like in the beginning of class, we started in a supine position, and we start with some short lever hip flexion and hip abduction. So we do that with our knee bent, right? Leg into the chest, leg out to the side, and then that progresses with the leg straight. Okay. Now that's going to require more stability in the hip to work with a longer lever. It's also going to require more compliance of the tissues that need to be able to lengthen to take us into that long lever position, most notably the hamstrings and the inner thighs. Another technique that is explored quite a lot in this class is that of what's called chain. So some movements that we do in this class are done with a closed chain, and some are done with an open chain. Okay, likewise, a closed chain regresses, an open chain progresses the movement. So chain technically refers to the distal ends of our body. So that would be hands, feet, head, making contact or effectively distributing their force into the earth. Sometimes we do that via a wall. Sometimes we do that, you could do that via like a dowel or a stick or a chair, something that's effectively connected to the earth. In the case of this class, I use a wall to close the chain between my hands and the wall at one point, and the floor, right? So doing things on two legs, right? We do those sort of assisted deadlifts or rather the unweighted deadlifts and the pelvic movements with 2 feet on the floor, and then opening the chain on one leg and doing it with 1 foot on the floor. Okay, so typically when we close the chain, we increase stability. When we open the chain, we decrease stability. Okay. There's also ways that we can use closed and open chains to effectively bring more feedback, more proprioception, and more kinesthetic awareness into our movements. And when we do that, sometimes we're not necessarily using the floor to close the chain or open the chain. Sometimes we're using touch, we're using contact of something. Okay. And in the case of this class, I use a strap at one point to close the chain between my foot and my hand. And I use a block on my sacrum, as someone mentioned, to give that feedback as to where my pelvis is in place. So I believe it was actually when I learned this from Trina, how she referenced the closing of a chain, if it's not the floor, is as a partial chain. Okay, so likewise, a partially closed chain or open can be used to increase feedback. Okay. So the partial closed chain, typically how I'll use that is sort of threefold. Okay, so when I close the chain between my hand and my foot in the supine section of class, Supta Pada Angushtasana, with the strap, I'm using that essentially to create a passive stretch. Likewise, in the beginning of class, pulling my knee into my chest, I'm using the force of my hands to hold my leg in place. It's a partially closed chain between my hands and my leg, and I'm using that to kind of access my passive range of motion. You can also use a partially closed chain to increase activation, or to further kind of load the joint. So pressing my knee into a block or pressing my knee into my hand. For those of you that say, my outer hips feel a bit sore after that class, we did a lot of kind of partially closed chain work, connecting knee to hand, pushing into myself to create more activation. So partially closed chains can help increase activation. And as I mentioned before, they can also help to increase feedback. Okay, so our nervous system really loves touch to help kind of figure out where it is in space, which we call proprioception, and also to help kind of figure out where it is relative to itself, okay, which we might call kinesthetic awareness. So again, the example there would be the block on our sacrum. Like, I'm not necessarily using the block to increase the activation of my pelvis. I'm not using the block as a passive stretch. I'm using that block to give me some feedback as to kind of where a level or neutral pelvis is. Looking at doing this comment here, progressive open chain, progressive closed chain. Yeah, so whenever the chain is closed, okay, that would be considered a regression, right? So because it's easier. It's gonna be easier to know where my pelvis is in space with the chain closed, with the feedback. It's gonna be easier to create the range of motion I'm looking for if I'm working with a closed chain. It's gonna be easier to activate the musculature if need be, if I'm in a closed chain. All those things become less accessible, more difficult when the chain is open. Those are the main principles that are explored in this class, but in general, you know, if you had asked me some years ago what the different ways you could use to regress or progress movements, what I would potentially have told you is primarily to affect the range of motion. Right, so if we're working with less range of motion or respectively more range of motion, then we're dealing with a deeper variation of the pose or a more modified version of the pose. Okay, so we do explore that a bit in this class. You know, Ardha Chandrasana and Virabhadrasana 3 are not poses that make use of the, you know, very deep ranges of motion, but there is some work to be done to open up the range of the joint that we can then stabilize through the different drills and different exercises that we do. So what I know to be true for me is that, and for most folks, is that when when the lever is shorter, I usually have a deeper range of motion available in my hip. Pull my knee deeper and closer towards my chest, flex my hip deeper. Once the lever lengthens, that range of motion decreases. Okay, so a lot of the work we do in the beginning of this particular class is about opening up and accessing the ranges of motion necessary to essentially manifest or bring our bodies into compliance with these particular poses. Can I give an example of an open chain version? Sure. So I'll give you 2 examples of open chain. So one of the things that we'll do to kind of progress a movement and make it more active as opposed to passive is to go from a closed or partially closed chain position to an open chain position. So in the beginning of class, we hold on to our shin and we pull our leg into our chest. Okay? So I'm using the force of my arms, a partially closed chain between my hand and my leg to bring my hip into flexion, the partially closed chain, and then I open that kinetic chain. And now the muscles of my hip have to hold my leg in place. So that goes from closed, partially closed, to open. Another example of that could be if I was in a quadruped position with one leg stepped back, right? So my right leg in this case is closed chain, my foot is in contact with the floor. As soon as I lift it off the floor, now I go into an open chain position. We do variations of the single leg, or rather the hip flexion in the class, with both of my feet closed chain here and a partially closed chain here on my hands and knees. And then that progresses into one foot being open chain, and we do the same movement. Hope that makes sense. So range of motion, closed and open chains, lever length, positional, and all of these, to some degree or another, will affect the degree of, or the amount of, load that's being exhibited in our joints or being exhibited as a result of the contraction of our muscles. So, you know, sort of obvious example of movement regression and progression can be experienced if you work with weights. You know, if you go to the gym, let's say the movement is flexing your elbow joint. Okay, if you want to progress that movement, you could add a 20-pound weight, right, to your hand, which will increase the amount of load being exhibited on your elbow, on your shoulder. So you'll have to exhibit more force in the contraction of your bicep to lift that weight. Okay, now if you added that weight and it was too much, right, if you're not able to flex your elbow, then you would need to effectively regress that load and maybe try a 15-pound weight, or try a 10-pound weight, or a 5-pound weight, or maybe take the weight away altogether and just practice the form open chain before you effectively load it. So working with extrinsic load is one effective way to progress or regress your movement capabilities. A lot of what we're talking about right now, because we don't often work with extrinsic load in a yoga practice, are different ways that you could position yourself relative to gravity, or make your arms, your legs longer or shorter, so that you can increase the amount of load in your joints without working with weights. Essentially, body weight training leverages biomechanics to increase your strength without the need necessarily for extrinsic loading. Loading can also be intrinsic, and you can think of that to a certain degree as the amount of activation of your muscles, right? So the more contraction, the more force of contraction I have in my muscles, the more force is going to be sent into my joints. Okay, we'll explore this quite a lot tomorrow in the isometrics class. Essentially, that's what the isometric drills seek to do, is to increase the intrinsic load on your joints so that the muscles actually are rendered stronger, so that when you do load them with kind of full body weight activity, you have the strength that you need. Okay. So for example, creating the partially closed chain between my hand and my knee and pressing my knee into my hand increases the force, or the intrinsic load in my outer hip, and likewise increases the strength and the activation capability of my outer hip muscles. Okay. So, using this chart, you say less loading would be a regression, more loading would be a progression. And something that can be a little confusing when studying this is the acknowledgement that a lot of the drills that we're doing are not so clear-cut regressed or progressed, but they can be both, right? So by doing something on the floor, something you said in the feedback, that you found that doing the pose supine, you actually got more contraction in your hip than when you were doing it standing. And to me, I say, okay, mission accomplished, because while we might want we might want that level of activation in the standing version, in fact, that level of activation might be what's needed to mitigate the potential damage, right, that would warrant that pose sort of like a no-go, right? So that what makes that pose or that transition controversial is because the individual performing it might lack the amount of strength to stabilize that position. So we do it on our backs, right? We regress the position so that we can progress the intrinsic force or the intrinsic load that we can exhibit in that in those stabilizers, so that when we progress the position, you have that sort of muscle memory in place, you have that strength in place that you can apply to the endeavor to make it, render it more sustainable. Okay. I'm seeing some questions coming through. I'm inclined to address these towards the end, but let's see here. Is extrinsic adding weight or body weight? To a certain extent, everything that we're doing here is affecting load, right? So if I lengthen the lever, that's going to affect the load. If I change my position relative to gravity, that's going to affect the load, right? So all of these techniques are essentially progressing or regressing load. When we talk about extrinsic versus intrinsic, my understanding at least is that with extrinsic loading, it's essentially adding something to your body, not just adding the length of your arm, but for example, if I lengthen the lever of my arm, that's going to add load to my shoulder, and then I could extrinsically load that further with the use of a prop. In this case, the prop is a shag pillow. Okay, so extrinsic just it refers to something that's not me being added to me. Okay? Extrinsic, outside of oneself. And because we don't often practice in studios that have extrinsic loading devices like weights, and maybe you do, maybe you have some at home. One way that you can increase the load of an extrinsic something or other is by also lengthening the lever, right? So like if you were to put a wooden block in your hand with a long lever, that actually would create quite a bit of force in the shoulder. Perhaps definitely more so than if you were to hold a wooden block, the shorter lever closer to your shoulder. So the more you understand these principles, the more you can play with them to accommodate, your needs based on the resources that you have available, right? And that's, that's also to say, something that I find quite interesting about the yoga practice is that, because we are often endeavoring to make things harder than they need to be, like how hard is it really to stand on two legs? I say that with sensitivity for folks that maybe aren't able to, but to stand on two legs can be done pretty efficiently. When we practice something like Tadasana, we choose to make the endeavor of standing on two legs much harder than it needs to be. We increase quite maximally the intrinsic loading of that position by kind of isometrically engaging all of our muscles, right? And we'll talk more tomorrow about why we might choose to do that. Something I often try to make clear to my students is, I'm not teaching you Tadasana to suggest that this is how you should always stand, right? Like if you were to put a 30-pound basket on top of your head, you might need to stand that way to contend with that load so it doesn't compress you. Okay. So, sometimes using the feedback or using the load, progressing the load can actually help to increase the intrinsic force so that when you take that feedback away, you take that load away, the student or the individual is more able to kind of contextualize and understand how to engage Tadasana, right? Which then becomes an open chain endeavor and might be more elusive to find those actions. So a lot of the things that we do in yoga are, closed chain with the legs, closed chain with one aspect or another, but because they're not loaded endeavors, we have to kind of simulate the load. We have to give a lot of cues and a lot of instructions to help our students understand how to activate more of their tissues, conceivably when they don't even need to be, right? So this might kind of pull on some metaphoric or thematic threads, but we could say, one approach might be, or one way of considering a lot of what we do in the yoga practice is making things, maybe even strength training in general, making things harder than they need to be, so that when we need these skills, we need the strength, we have it available to us. Right? And that's where things sort of crossfade into the conversation around function. Right? We want to make something functional, then we need to simulate opportunities to develop the skill so that we can use it off the mat. We can use it in our life when life requires us to balance on one leg, or life requires us to kind of navigate through different planes and different transitions successfully. Can we get one more example of regressing a position in order to progress load? Yes. So let's say that I'm wanting to progress the intrinsic load on my shoulders in the movement that I'll call adduction or adduction. Okay. Now, why might I want to do this? Well, who knows? Maybe I'm going to be working on pushing strength or push-ups, which we'll look at tomorrow. And I want to load the tissues in my chest. So I could say to my students, engage your chest. And they'd say, okay, how? Engage your chest by isometrically squeezing your hands towards each other. And maybe someone is able to do that. Okay. Or I could regress by creating a partially closed chain between my hands, or I could even do that with my fingertips themselves and say, now squeeze onto the thing. Squeeze, in this case, squeeze the dry eraser. Okay, so I've regressed the chain between my hands so that then I can progress the intrinsic force, right? And I can squeeze onto the eraser and work harder now that I have something to squeeze onto. And then if I was to take that away, and then you were to isometrically do that, kind of gets more complex. Now both sides of the joint, inner and outer shoulder, need to be working to hold myself in that open chain position. Okay. So again, if this is the first time you're kind of wrapping your head around these concepts, it's a bit like a puzzle. You kind of have to look at movements through a different lens. But my hope is that by giving you this language, you can go back to really any class that I have on the platform, but certainly this particular class, and identify what's really going on in these drills and these movements with a sort of expanded vocabulary. Okay. Let me give you a couple more techniques here, and then, as it turns out, I'm going to need to take a 3-minute bathroom break. So maybe you do too. If you're like waiting for that part in the movie where it's like, okay, to go to the bathroom, it'll be in just a moment. Something that I do when I'm like gearing up to present or to teach, maybe it's connected to nerves, is like I drink a lot of water. And then I go, oh, maybe that wasn't a great idea. Okay, so other ways that we can progress or regress our movements would be through the variable of time, right? So doing things more times, holding something for longer time. Time, it's a little difficult to say if it's a progression or a regression because it depends on what you're talking about. Sometimes doing something faster progresses the skill, like, can you activate and get all those things to happen more quickly? That would represent a progression. At other times, by going more quickly, you decrease the amount of time that your body is being loaded, right? So if it's a pose, like extending the amount of time that you're in the shape would be a progression. If it's a movement, increasing the time or increasing the speed could be a regression or a progression. If we're talking about rest, then I might say like having more rest in between repetitions, or even more rest in between your practice, that would be a regression. So I'm not going to write regress or progress relative to time, but just know that is a variable that can influence the difficulty or the adaptation that your body undergoes, how often you do something, or how many times you do something. Something we also play with quite a bit is sensory awareness, which can also connect with our feedback, right? So practicing with eyes open, practicing with eyes closed. Just on a personal note, because I teach a lot on Yoga International and various, I teach online, I often will look and watch the classes that I've taken and go, oh, that's what my body's doing. Like, I thought my pelvis was pretty level when I was working with that block, and then I watch the video back and I see the block wobbling around. So I'm getting sort of delayed feedback on what my body is doing, or what I might call like a more objective feedback on what's actually happening, right? So sensory awareness would be anything that we do to sort of increase the visual, typically visual feedback about what our movements actually are, right? So like what it feels like to do something might be different than what's actually happening. Practicing in front of a mirror would increase feedback. Practicing like in a dimly lit space by candlelight might decrease feedback. So in general, less sensory awareness, less sensory feedback would be a progression of the skill. More sensory awareness would be a regression of the skill. You can also play with stability. And, again, a lot of these are going to kind of crossfade. Typically when we lengthen a lever, it becomes less stable. So that when we open a chain, we become less stable. But, if we are to deliberately affect or impact our base of support, rendering it more or less stable, that's going to likewise, more stability, more regressed, less stability, more progressed. Okay, so example of that, one typical example that we almost always use to regress our movements would be practicing on a sticky mat, right? So practicing on the yoga mat gives us more friction, gives us more stability, extrinsic stability. So we don't have to kind of source that stability from within. The mat is holding us in position. Okay, so a fun thing to play with, and I have a number of classes on the platform that make use of a blanket, right? So instead of practicing on the mat, we practice on the blanket, which radically decreases our stability, which therefore requires more intrinsic force to stabilize you. Okay? This particular class, the single leg stability, doesn't work too much with stability as a factor in terms of the terrain or the surface, but you'll see plenty of classes that I have on the platform that do play with that. So, you know, how I mentioned before, how I might progress the stability factor in a class like this could be then, you know, if we had more time, attempting the transition Ardha Chandrasana to Vira 3, standing on a bolster, right? So a less stable surface. Someone asked in the Facebook group, does this class need to be done on a hard surface? And I wasn't sure if the question was suggesting that like maybe you wanted to practice it at the beach, like on the sand, or like, yeah, someone says here, like practicing on a stand-up paddleboard definitely decreases stability. So you have to kind of increase your intrinsic stability. You know, you could do it practicing on a couple of blocks, right? So decreasing the base of support. And in a lot of instances, you know, the invitation here is that we might kind of, there's sort of like various ways you can interpret the title regress to progress. It could be that like, if you want to progress, a good way to do that might be to regress. Like regressing your movements can help you progress. It also sort of gives you the sequencing strategy, go from a more regressed to progressed position. And sometimes, you know, we also might progress to progress, which is to say, if you have a difficult time balancing on a mat, we might actually put you on a more unstable surface, so it becomes even harder to balance, so that then kind of by contrast, when you get back on the mat, it feels more stable. It's sort of like the analogy that comes to mind often is Olympic athletes that will train at high elevation where it's a progressed environment. And then when they come down off the mountain, it's actually easier to perform the skill. So these are all different ways that we can sort of play with different movements. And, you know, once you have the movement mapped, then doesn't mean it's finished. It just means now you can progress and try it in different ways. The goal is not always to continue like progressing endlessly, because there might be, as some of you mentioned, there might be some aspects of the movement that would be brought into sharper view or clearer view by kind of regressing and taking it back to a different position or a different approach to experiencing it. Okay. I practiced on a wrestling mat. I found the floor is so much easier. Yeah, like the wrestling mat has a bit of kind of spring to it. So it's not it's more forgiving if you fall, but it's not as it's not as clear a path of force to the earth, right? So your body has to work a little bit harder to find stability. Wall to wall composition. Yeah, and you know, something that I will sometimes put in here as a technique or as an approach to likewise progress or regress is this concept of contextual interference, which sounds like quite it's like word porn for the yoga nerd. Contextual interference refers to, as it says, interfering with the context in which you experience something, right? So if the context of your yoga practice is that it's always done on a mat at a particular time of day, in a particular spot in the room, in a particular sequence, you know, you go from this pose to this pose, the more kind of specific and repetitive the context, to a certain extent, our nervous system learns the skill. You know, we learn that skill relative to that context. So something that a lot of us are experiencing just by just by virtue of the fact that our context is being disrupted. As a teacher, the context that I'm accustomed to presenting is very much not this. I'm used to seeing other people when I'm teaching, not looking at myself, right? So this is contextual interference for me. I'm having to progress my capacity to teach by doing so in a context that is unfamiliar. All of these different techniques could provide some degree of contextual interference for you if you have a certain sentiment around how it is that you practice. But it's to say, the context that we create could provide stability for us, and it could be useful to have sort of the repetitive element in place. And we'll do that a lot of times. You might choose to start your classes with sun salutations every time, just to give your students sort of that familiar kind of grounding, expected context. And then you can open up and try and play with different things. In my case, I tend to constantly be playing with the context and sort of messing with my students' expectation, not because I'm I don't know, I'm a good guy, I want to help, but along those lines, the more I can help my students to map a skill independent of sort of their contextual dependence, the more I believe they will really own that skill and apply it in a functional way to a broader context than just their movements on the mat. Okay, let's do this. It's 2:08. Let's take those 3 minutes. I know it's happening in my bladder. It's needing to happen now in real life. Let's take a few minutes and we'll reconvene at 2:12. Time yourself. Take a moment to let this kind of digest. If you do have questions about this, write it down, write those questions down, and we will have time, I promise, at the end to dive into all of it. When we come back, we're going to look at the worksheets and how we can take this information and actually apply it to our practice and to our sequencing and to our understanding of movement and pose. Okay. All right, so what I'd like to do now is give you some orientation around these worksheets that I've created for you, with the caveat that I think I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but my goal as a teacher really is to inspire and to encourage you, to encourage my students, people that I work with, to expand and perhaps refine the type of questions that you're asking. It's less interesting for me to give you information or kind of give you answers, and more interesting to, I think, provide you with a process of inquiry that can lead you to kind of never-ending answers. So when I create worksheets and when I give information out in this way, it's more my tendency to kind of provide you with that framework of really passing along the type of questions that I ask, with the understanding and the expectation that you're going to come up with different answers than the ones that I come up with. And that's actually much more exciting for me than us sort of arriving at the same conclusions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see, let's see, my Google page. Hopefully this works. Okay. I'm going to go into the first worksheet that I want to take a look at is actually no, not that one. It's the pose inventory worksheet. So if you go to the first section on the, in the course, you'll see kind of the introduction and kind of before the actual, before this, what am I trying to say? Before this session's section before has a link for the pose inventory worksheet. Okay, so I'm assuming you guys can see this pulled up on my screen. Yes. Okay. So the intention with this particular worksheet, again, is to help you kind of ask some more nuanced questions about what it is that you endeavor to teach or to practice, that then you can leverage into a sequence that is, hopefully hopefully meaningful and effective for yourself and your students. Depending on your background, your familiarity, your knowledge base, not every question in this worksheet is going to have an easy answer for you. And that can either be a good thing, it can inspire you to go reach out and learn some more. It can be an overwhelming thing, in which case just skip it. And depending on your vocabulary, you can kind of choose to identify and articulate your understanding in ways that make most sense to you. Every training that I teach is always a mixed level training, in that I'm already aware that for a lot of you, what we covered so far was like more or less review. For some of you, you're hearing it for the first time. For others of you, maybe you already teach this stuff. And so like that means that the spectrum of like familiarity and overwhelmment is going to be pretty broad amongst especially 150 plus people from around the world. So please, know that the intention is to give you 1, 2, 3, a couple like new strategies that you can put into practice and put into play for yourself and for your students, for those of you that teach. The goal is not that you understand everything and that you're able to make use of everything right away. So that's the disclaimer before we kind of dive deeper. So the pose inventory worksheet can be done relative to a pose or relative to a movement. In the case of this particular class, I'm really exploring a movement. And the movement that I'm exploring is posturally from Virabhadrasana 3 to Ardha Chandrasana. And if I'm to identify that more kind of anatomically, it's moving from a flexed hip position. Yes. Then it's moving from a flexed hip position to an abducted hip position and back to a flexed position. Now I'm doing that closed chain on one leg, right, in a standing position as opposed to a supine. So the different regressions are going to kind of find variations in how I'm exploring those forces. For our purposes, just to kind of keep this worksheet a little simpler, I'm just going to choose one of those poses and not kind of attempt to fill this in relative to a movement, but certainly you could if that was of interest to you. So let's assume for our purposes that the pose that we're going to be looking at is the pose Virabhadrasana 3. Okay, so I would write in here, and again, you can print this out and use it. You can just sort of use it as a template or a starting point. But let's assume the pose is Virabhadrasana 3. Okay, the category of pose I might write or identify as a standing balancing pose. That could also be positional, right? In which case, same thing. It's in the standing category, and it's a balance pose. Virabhadrasana 3. This next section here asks you to kind of reflect on different ways that you could enter that pose and different ways that you could exit that pose. Something that I'm aware of when it comes to shape study or pose study is that no pose just sort of pops up out of nowhere. There's always the context of what happened before and what happened afterwards. So before we kind of identify like what the pose is, we have to sort of at least consider what happened before and what happened after the pose to give it context. So steps to enter and exit the pose is also going to be relative to your familiarity. If you're a vinyasa practitioner, how you might enter Vira 3 might be different than if you, say, come from the Iyengar tradition, or I don't think Vira 3 is part of the Ashtanga primary, but depending on your lineage or your style of movement, Vira 3 is going to have a different entry and exit point. So, whether you write that down or whether you just kind of consider it, I'm going to step away here so my voice might get a little quieter, but I might say kind of for the first question here, steps to enter and exit, what would be the kind of quickest, most direct path into Vira 3 and out of Vira 3? Okay. So steps to enter and exit could be from essentially Tadasana and back to Tadasana this way. If you come from the Iyengar tradition, I believe the pose is entered from sort of a wide stance, turn, Virabhadrasana 1, and then it's a tip forward into Vira 3, and then back to Vira 1, and then it turns to the second side, back to Tadasana. If you practice vinyasa, perhaps that entry starts in down dog. It's a step forward and a shift forward into Vira 3. And in the case of this class, the alternative strategy is really what I wanted to explore, right? Which is entering and exit from something more like an Ardha Chandrasana, or something that includes Ardha Chandrasana. So sort of the standing arching position or this hip flex position, and then that kind of hip hinges into Vera 3, right? And then there's a closed chain abduction into Ardha Chandrasana, and then this shortened lever that brings us back up and wraps back around. So admittedly, I'm exploring in this class a somewhat more complex or progressed entry and exit strategy. I'm going to make myself small again. Make the screen big. Okay. So, you could certainly expand upon these categories to contemplate different orders of operation or different entry and exit strategies to take you into and out of the pose. Because, every pose really is a frozen moment along a broader spectrum of movement. And tomorrow when we talk about theming, perhaps there's some interesting metaphors for life there, right? Like every moment is really part of a streamline of moments that really have no beginning and have no end. So what we choose to identify and isolate and dissect and investigate is really boundaried by our awareness. It's boundaried by our decision to look at this and not that. So the next section here asks to contemplate, the positional regressions and progressions. Okay, so when I say supported here, I'm referring to the floor position, okay, or whether that's supine or prone, or even side lying could be kind of a progression of supported position. Okay, so what might Virabhadrasana 3 look like if it was done supine? Okay, and in the case of this particular pose, Vira 3 might actually have a different name, right? It might look like Supta Padangusthasana if it's done in a supine position. Okay. What might Vira 3 look like if it was done in a crawling or a quadruped position? Okay. And when I say what it might look like, of course, it's not going to look like the full pose, right? So there's going to be some regressions of other aspects of the pose, like the length of the lever, the closed or open chain status of the arms or the elbows. The standing leg might turn into a bent knee when it's done in a crawling position versus a standing position. So just by reflecting on these different positional orientations of the pose, you are inevitably going to be regressing and progressing different aspects of the pose. But this is a really good starting point. And if any of our conversation around the various techniques of progression seem kind of overwhelming, this is where I would recommend that you start. How I initially learned this technique was from one of my mentors and teachers and friends, Noah Maze, who would encourage us to take a picture of the pose and then just like turn the picture around and put it on the floor and flip it this way and flip it that way and see what that sort of stimulated in our consciousness as we kind of looked at how the pose might orient itself relative to gravity, relative to our base of support in different ways. Then we go into sitting or kneeling. Positional regressions of Vira 3, standing, of course, the standing position. Standing position could be Vira 3. It also might look like Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana. I'll demonstrate these in a moment once it's time for me to get big again. And then I think, okay, so there's a little bit of a typo here. It will be, I believe, corrected in the next 24 hours on your PDF. This should be two distinct sections. So we have inverted, which is to represent the final progression in the positional progressions. And then joint positions would be the next category. So it's not meant to say inverted joint positions. It's meant to say inverted, and then we'll go on to joint positions. So reflecting on how Vira 3 might manifest or how it might show up in all these positions could lead us to some different considerations around how we can explore that pose in our sequence. So let me make myself a bit larger. I'll show you some of my ideas here. So for example, from a supine position, right, if I take Virabhadrasana 3 and put it on my back, right, it might look something like this, okay, which can be done open chain in this leg, or it could be done with a partially closed chain or with a strap. We call that Supta Pada Dushtasana. Right? You know, technically, it could also be done in a sideline position, which brings some interesting feedback as well. Right now, this long lever of my leg is being lifted by my outer hip instead of by the flexors on the front of my hip. I believe there's at least one class of mine on the platform that explores some of these movements. The isometrics class where hip explores some of these movements. That's also just born out of taking the shape and flipping it into different positions. If we go into a crawling position, now, like the standing leg is going to be shorter lever. Okay, my hands, of course, now are closed chain on the floor. And Vira 3 might look like this sort of variation of bird dog. Okay, go here or go here. So, you know, this position shares some component parts and aspects to Vira 3 with a bit more support. And I could even regress that further and, you know, close the chain here. So while the shape doesn't necessarily resemble Vira 3 too much, if we kind of look at it with a more nuanced eye, you can see how some of the joint positions and orientations are going to be applicable to that pose. From a seated position or a kneeling position, let's see. There's some interesting things we could do that are Vira 3 reminiscent. Right? So if I was kneeling and I took one leg in front of me, now this would be the otherwise standing leg of Vira 3. This would be the back leg of Vira 3. And the endeavor here might be more like a balancing scenario, right? Where this back leg is having to do some stabilizing work. Right? Where the standing version of Vira 3 typically looks like this, if I reorient which leg is open chain, which leg is closed chain, now Vira 3 could be here. It's sort of this variation of Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana. So that section of the worksheet is to stoke your creativity to consider where those poses live in different orientations to gravity. Simple names of the poses. I don't know what else to call Vira 3 other than Vira 3. Oh, so Supta Padangusthasana. Yeah, you know, like sometimes I tend to use the Sanskrit names only because they're somewhat universal, and we might all call that something different based, you know, relative to what our experience is. For the sake of simplicity, you can just call it a supine version of Warrior 3. Okay, Supta Padangusthasana just means reclined hand to big toe, or reclined big toe pose. Airplane, yeah, airplane works. What's in a name? Okay, I'm gonna go back to the chart here. Let's see. All right, so next up we have this section asking to identify and reflect on the joint positions. So, you know, I've been using some anatomical terms here. It would take sort of its own separate training to really dive into the anatomical vocabulary of all this. If you have that knowledge base already, then you could certainly insert those labels into these particular categories. If not, it's not necessary in my mind that you have the anatomical joint positions identified as such, but that you are clear on what the shape is. So for the spine, for example, in Warrior 3, I might say that the spine is in an axially extended position, which just means it's in its neutral position and lengthened. But you know, you might say the spine is neutral. You might say the spine is in Tadasana. Relative to Warrior 3, where we're having to kind of lift our back up away from the floor, there is a little bit of extension in the spine to bring us upright. Kind of furthering the inventory of the pose, the pelvis in Vira 3 is more or less neutral, right? The hip position, we have one hip that's flexed, one hip that's extended. So the standing leg of Warrior 3 is in a flexed position. The extended leg, or the back leg of Vera 3 is in extension. Okay. The shoulders, depending on how you approach the pose, traditionally the shoulders would be overhead or in a flexed position overhead. How I chose to approach the shoulders in this particular class was to kind of make them more of a non-issue. So I shortened the lever of my spine, of our spine, by kind of just bringing our arms a little bit closer in, or closing the chain and putting them on blocks. That was done because my intention was to really focus on the hip, and the more complicated the pose becomes, the more factors are in place, the more progressed it becomes. So for the class, a longer class, we might have done more work to play with the shoulders as levers to further strengthen the back. Elbow, wrist, not so applicable to this particular pose. Elbows are straight. Knee, ankle, you might have some sentiment around what goes on with your back ankle, if it's dorsiflexed or plantar flexed. To me, both are interesting, both are worth exploring. But more or less in Virabhadrasana 3, both knees are straight or extended. And what you'll find, so that as we go through the different regressions and progressions of the pose, is that a lot of these core joint positions will be the same. Certainly as we get closer or more proximal, get closer to the trunk, the shoulder position, the hip position are going to be the same. As we get more distal, as we move further away from the trunk, the joint positions might change as we shorten and lengthen levers. So for some of the positions, we have the knees bent versus legs straight, or the elbows bent versus elbows straight. Okay, so this next chart here is meant to really encourage you to consider what, I always try to not say this in a way that sounds fear-mongery, like what could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong about Vera 3? So I've written this as compensation patterns. Sometimes we identify compensations as like misalignments, which is not a bad way of identifying a compensation, but I think that if you're anything like me, I'm somewhat programmed to believe that a misalignment can lead to damage, or a misalignment means something is something dangerous is happening. Misalignment in my mind is just anything happening that's other than what you mean to happen. Okay, so for example, if I'm looking to get my back hip extended and parallel to the floor and it's not, that would be a misalignment. Right? Doesn't mean that the pose is dangerous, doesn't mean that your hip's going to explode or fall off, but it would be a misalignment, or sort of a discrepancy between what I'm going for and what's actually happening. So I've written that as a compensation, which is just to suggest what tends to happen when we're going for these joint positions. And to a certain extent, if you were to go back and look through the different joint positions, a compensation could be any of those things not happening. Right, so if you're looking to bring the front hip into flexion and create a neutral pelvis, and the pelvis instead is tipped forward and the front hip is sort of internally rotated or something, that would be a compensation other than what we're going for. Now, if that's what you're going for, the compensation no longer is a compensation. Now it just becomes an opportunity to explore a different organization of Virabhadrasana 3. So what this chart is starting to leverage is your understanding of regressions and feedback. So when I say feedback here, I'm referring primarily to closed or partially closed chains. That could be in the form of you as a teacher offering feedback to your student. For example, in the quadruped position, when we were doing the hip movements, I was clear that it might be difficult to keep the pelvis neutral. So the feedback strategy was to put a block on top of your pelvis so that you had some feedback as to where kind of a level sacrum was. The modification strategy then asks you to say, well, if with the feedback, if with the heightened awareness, it's still not possible, how might you further regress the movement so that it likewise can be possible? Okay, so let's go through this with just a couple examples and see if we can make some sense out of how this might look. Okay, so feel free to write it in if you'd like. I'll kind of pull on my own experience of teaching yoga, which is to say, like, what are some of the common compensations that you have experienced either in your own body or in your students' bodies relative to Warrior 3. Okay, so when you go to teach Warrior 3, what are some of the things that you see happen that might be different from what you're going for? Okay, uneven hips. Okay, uneven hips. So I take that to mean that, you know, if in Virabhadrasana 3, the goal is for my pelvis to remain kind of oriented in the sagittal plane, meaning it's not turning from side to side, then when I go into hip flexion, knock over everything. When I go into hip flexion here, the pelvis will tend to turn a little bit to the side. So kind of somewhere between Ardha Chandrasana and Virabhadrasana 3 is where the pelvis tends to kind of end up. Okay, is that what you're referring to in uneven hips? Ooh, toes are abducted. Yeah. Okay, so you know, again, in my mind, that's not a bad thing, right? That's just, we have Ardha Chandrasana, we have Warrior 3, and then we have an infinitesimal amount of options between those two. So what makes it a compensation is it's probably other than what you and what the student is going for. So one way that you could create feedback to help somebody kind of figure out where their pelvis is in space is you might very well place a block on their sacrum and give them the clear instruction to not let the block slide off, right? So if I put a block on my sacrum and my pelvis was uneven, or my pelvis turned to the side, then that block is going to fall. Okay, so the feedback strategy here is going to help me locate neutral pelvis, okay, in Warrior 3. Now, just because somebody has increased feedback doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be successful at being able to achieve that. Okay, so then the modification strategy might be, I wish you could see how these cats are staring at me like, who are you talking to? Just talking into that light box like a fool. Anyway, how you might regress that movement would then be to shorten the lever on the bottom leg. And then you might still use the same feedback loop with the block to kind of see if you can locate a neutral pelvis with closed chain in the hand, short lever in the bottom leg, so on and so forth. Now, it might also warrant a different, I mean, you could heavily regress that and take it all the way down onto the floor. So what's nice about doing the pose on our back is now the feedback is coming not in the form of a block, but it's coming in the form of the support and feedback of the floor. Okay, so flipping the pose upside down, you might, you know, if the learning outcome of that class is really about how to maintain a neutral or level pelvis, then that lesson conceivably starts all the way in reclined hand to big toe pose, or however you choose to address that, right? We could put somebody here and say, you know, bring your attention to the two sides of your sacrum, or your SI joints, and turn your pelvis to the left and feel, you know, your right SI joint lift off the floor, okay, and then press the right side of your pelvis into the floor. Okay, so this movement sort of on a loop could be to create clarity by contrast around an uneven, quote unquote, uneven pelvis and an even pelvis here. Okay? Then that could progress into a position here where then the pelvis turns and closes, or you know, the hips abduct and adduct. And then it can progress further, maybe hands on the wall or hands on a chair, right? And that movement progresses again from here all the way to Warrior 3. So something that I like to explore a lot if I'm trying to help somebody identify a particular position is, instead of kind of ruling the compensation as inappropriate, let's say, let's actually go into that compensation on purpose. So instead of it being something that you're sort of accidentally falling into, you are consciously navigating your way there and then reversing, right? This concept of reversibility, like as long as you can get in there and you can get out of there, it's fine. If your body just sort of habitually goes there without awareness, I think it's the lack of awareness that could render it a less stable or potentially, injurious position, not the position itself. Okay? One of my favorite quotes about kind of the concept of misalignment is that there really are no inappropriate or bad joint positions. There's just positions where we might lack awareness, or positions that we haven't effectively trained. Cool. Yeah, and so of course, like using the wall would provide another entry point for increased stability and feedback. The wall could be on your hands. The wall could also be on your back foot. Right? So putting your back foot on the wall would close the chain through your back leg, which is going to give you the ability to now distribute force through your leg into something, into a fixed object, and also just more stability. Right? So now the wall is also going to sort of help you hold your leg in position so that you have a little bit less force going into that standing hip, and some of it's sent into the wall. Now you have a little bit more leeway for how you choose to organize. Okay. So let's actually move on from this section in the chart, just looking at the time here. But this go here. This area of the chart is really meant to kind of get you brainstorming around what you might do to help your student further kind of locate where their body is in space, or how their bodies are self-organizing, and then how you might regress the movement to make that particular action more accessible to them. Okay, the last question here, function and application. This is really meant to, I guess, as it suggests, give you more, just get your mind thinking about how this pose can find a function and application in more areas than just, say, your ability to do Warrior 3, right? Because for me, like, being able to do Warrior 3 is a it's a worthwhile endeavor, but it starts to become a little hollow after a certain point if it doesn't necessarily apply to other things that I do in my life. So the question, what functional skills does this pose provide? How might this pose or movement show up in other forms of physical training or in your daily life? So I'll actually toss that to you guys. Like, if you think about Warrior 3 and what kind of happens coming into and out of Warrior 3, are there other times in your life, just in your daily life, where you find yourself making use of maybe not the full pose, but this endeavor of tipping forward on one leg, or every day bending over? If you're someone that does strength training or calisthenics or works with weights, where does Warrior 3 kind of show up in that modality? Yeah, a one-leg Romanian deadlift, picking up the laundry basket, yeah, losing balance on ice, picking up your kids' toys, making the bed. Yeah, so like if you are to, like, who knows why, like, where for whatever reason there's the chasm here, and you want to like pick up the object that's kind of far away over there, you might need to offset your balance, or rather, to distribute your weight back in order to tip further forward and get yourself back up. Okay? So there's sort of functionality there and being able to reach and grab. In weight training, we have these movements called deadlifts, which essentially eccentrically lengthen our hamstrings and then shorten or concentrically contract the hamstrings to bring us back up. So the deadlift is a hamstring strengthener. And if you are working with weights, then you can increase the load in your legs by progressing one of the chains, right? So doing a single leg deadlift could be a way to further develop strength if you don't have extrinsic load. Okay? And then if you were to lengthen that lever, right, the Warrior 3 very well can become a single leg deadlift. If you wanted to add load, you might work with a kettlebell, hold on to something, get a backpack. Yeah, and a lot of the compensation patterns that happen in Warrior 3 are relative, I find, to kind of not having clarity around what that skill is. So, if you just look at Warrior 3, remember when I first kind of learned about pose alignment, it was a lot of like looking at a shape, and then there'd be lots of arrows about like where everything should be wrapping and squeezing and lifting and pushing. It was sort of a big light bulb moment for me when I realized that those arrows weren't necessarily telling me what I should do once I'm in the pose. Those arrows were telling me what I did to get into the pose and what I would do to get out of the pose. Really, those arrows are more indicative of the movement, right? Not just the isometric actions. It can be both, but by giving the pose some kind of application and locomoting the pose or animating the pose or giving the pose function, it can give us a little bit more well-rounded context for maybe why or how these particular alignment points or action points are of value. So that last question is really to both kind of round out your consideration of the pose, but also, depending on your sequencing, that could be what you do at the end of class, right? So you could scatter some stuff around the room and play a game with your students where now it's like, see what the furthest object is that you can pick up standing on one leg. Okay. And, I say that with the understanding that most of us aren't working live with students at the moment, but in the future, conceivably we will. And even just in your own movement practice, and these are things we can be facilitating in our online classes as well. Working on the balance with this strong asana can calm the mind. Yeah, and then there's the different metaphorical threads that we can pull on. I think it makes good sense to me, or it resonates with me, that we're all sort of standing on a progressed base of support right now, meaning like our foundation collectively doesn't feel all that stable. And so how do we find stability when the foundations that we've been standing on are kind of being washed away in various ways? Okay, so what makes yoga for me, what makes these deadlifts and these movements yoga, and not just kind of doing a deadlift, which is not to suggest that there's anything wrong with that, is that the invitation to explore more dimensions of how these movements really apply to the lives that we're living are of interest, I think, to those of us that practice. Okay, I want to take a look at the last worksheet. We're going to go through it a little bit quickly because I'm bumping up against the hour here, but a lot of this I know is table setting. The reason I wanted to cover this today is because essentially the regression and progression work and this pose inventory worksheet for me applies to everything that I teach, right? So like if I'm going to teach a movement or even consider what's required or different strategies to map a particular movement, these are the kind of questions that I want to be reflecting on. Okay. When it comes time to actually leverage that into a sequence, or a sequence like the one that we took, or the one that I taught, this particular worksheet will help to do that. Now, one final thought about that before we dive into it is that the class that I taught, the single leg stability class, is a class that's being offered on an online platform where someone can click on the class, know what it's about, know how much time it is, and know what they're getting. Okay, so it's not a class, if you've noticed, that had a traditional kind of opening and centering. There's like kind of the aspects that we might come to appreciate about yoga, like the pranayama, the meditation, the invocation, the intention, the shavasana. All those things you might notice were not a part of the class, which isn't to suggest that they shouldn't be or that they couldn't be, but for the purposes of what we're diving into today, those aspects are not on the table, or were not on the table in this class, because I fully respect and honor, like, however it is you choose to pull kind of those aspects or those features into your class together. Hope that makes sense. So in terms of the principles, the nerding out that we're doing here, all that is sort of accessory to it, but certainly are of value. So if you're someone that teaches primarily vinyasa, you can still find ways to thread these principles into your vinyasa sequencing. We'll look at that more on Sunday. But the template that I've created is really more for, let's say, like a alignment-based class, if you want to call it that, or the type of class we're really working on a particular pose or building a specific skill. So let's take a look at that last worksheet. It's the worksheet entitled Regress to Progress. And it looks like this. Okay. So a lot of it's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to go through every section of it with you. And it's not meant to say like, this is exactly how you're going to map your sequence, but it's organized, as we talked about already, based on the positional regressions and progressions, and then different considerations that you might make within that. Okay, so the first step of the worksheet is to take inventory of your pose, which we do in the last worksheet, including the joint positions, the difficulties, common compensation patterns. And then we use this worksheet to brainstorm regressions and progressions for the pose of focus. And of course, depending on the level of the class, the time available, the type of pose, your sequence's beginning and end points will vary based on your unique intentions. Okay, so if you're working with a demographic that is capable of doing this particular pose or this particular transition, then the starting point might be different than if you're really mapping the pose kind of from zero. So in the case of this class that I taught, the pose or movement of focus was the transition from Vira 3 to Ardha Chandrasana and vice versa. The type of pose, it's a standing balanced pose. And the intended learning outcomes for students was really relative to lateral hip stability as we kind of change planes and shift our weight on one leg. So the learning outcomes for this class were pretty straightforward. Wanted to create single leg stability. That's what the name of the class is, as we move into these dynamic positions. I'm not sure what the level of this class is listed on the platform. In my mind, this was like a level 1-2 class. There's no obviously universal parameters for what might make a class level 1, level 2. But what I'm often thinking of is, in this class, I would say Ardha Chandrasana and Vira 3 are, fundamental yoga poses. So Half Moon and Warrior 3. But transitioning between those two poses might not be necessarily a fundamental skill. Okay, and because that transition in the positional progression is pretty high up, right? It's a single leg balance pose, and then transitioning between the two, I would bump that closer to the level 2 than to the level 1 skill. Okay. That said, in this particular class, there wasn't much that was assumed, meaning most of the movements started from a pretty regressed position and were sort of built incrementally. So for all those reasons, I would sort of crossfade. So this was a level 1-2 class. The time, I believe this was a 45-minute class. The props that I used in this class were blocks and a strap and a mat and a wall. So in light of what I just mentioned to you guys here, this opening section, again, the class that you experienced with me doesn't really have an opening section, but it very well could have. I often will design the class and then kind of work backwards to figure out how I want to start the class. Okay, so if there are ideas, we've sort of shared some of them just organically here in conversation, ideas for what the theme of class could be. And the theme could very well just be what the class is called. So the class in this case was called Single Leg Balance Transitions or Single Leg Stability. The theme idea could also be like finding stability amidst shaky ground, whatever you want to kind of, whatever threads you want to pull on. Ultimately, that can kind of take us into a whole lesson and inquiry around Dharma. So how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. Breathing practices, again, could be reflective of the theme or reflective of what you think might be of value to help teach this particular lesson. And then awakening movements, that could reference sort of the contextual familiarity under which you practice yoga. So if you always start your class with 3 rounds of Surya A, 3 rounds of Surya B, or you have something that you do that sort of gets your body and your mind in the zone, awakening movements could be sort of a set warm-up that you always do, or it could be movements relative to the practice that you have planned. In the case of this class, the warm-ups, so to speak, were just regressions of the full pose. So the first section here is asking us to kind of create a sequence relative to supported or floor-based movements, supine and prone. I have passive and active here. If you look at the class again, or look at the sequencing PDF for the class, the passive movements are typically partially closed chain movements that support the joint position, right? So we do knee to chest, hip flexion, and then it becomes active, okay? We abduct, take the leg to the side, that's passive, and then it becomes active. Hold your leg in position, okay? With feedback or with no feedback, open chain, or rather closed chain, or respectively open chain. That could be the same thing as the passive and active. With feedback could be, this is a passive, this is active. Then I could add some feedback here and even some load. Some resistance. I could push and make it harder for my leg to hold this position. Okay, or like we did in the second, the third variation of the class, abducting the knee onto the block and then pressing into the block to activate the outer hip. So there was some partially closed chain feedback there, and then using that to increase the activation, and then we created some mobility. Okay, so it doesn't have to be followed in this order. These are just different things to kind of stoke your creativity. And then additional ideas here. How might you play with the variable of time? How might you play with load? How might you play with lever length, etc. And then we have the crawling movements. So consider crawling movements can include variations on hands and knees, should be quadruped, could be done in plank or downward facing dog. Consider the variations of the pose that can be explored in these positions. Okay, so in the class that we took, there's some quadruped hip rotations. So essentially we do the full sequence, the full hip movements that are done standing on our knees. We do it in two different ways. One just moving the hip, and then the other one moving the hip and the pelvis. We didn't quite do any variations in this class in plank. Okay, so I omitted that section, but we do it in quadruped, and then we did it in downward facing dog. Okay, and then additional ideas. You could play with stability here. You could play with transitions, right? So transitions could find you kind of transitioning from a crawling position to a kneeling position or to a sitting position, and also play with feedback as I do in the class using the block on your sacrum. Then we move into the sitting/kneeling position. Again, this section I didn't explore in the class we took together. I say when brainstorming variations, consider the factors of stability and range of motion that can change depending on if you're sitting with your pelvis on the floor or kneeling on one or both shins or with your pelvis lifted. So that's to say that not all sitting, kneeling positions are equally accessible, right? If I'm sitting here, right, that's going to be a different kind of organization than if I'm here, than if I'm here. Okay, so incrementally a bit more progressed, and there can be some various factors that could contribute to the accessibility there. So what are seated variations of your pose? What are kneeling variations of your pose? And then some additional variations or considerations. Now, in the case of this particular class, the standing, it is a standing pose. So it naturally progresses to standing, but it could be the case that the pose that you're choosing to work on isn't a standing pose. Maybe it's a seated pose, or maybe it's a kneeling pose, or maybe it's a pose that's done in a supine position. So if that's the case, if you're not necessarily building to a standing pose, it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't progress to standing. Sometimes taking the pose and making it an upright pose, while that is a progressed position, it could regress other aspects of the pose that could make the regress position more accessible. So they say here, if your movement or pose of focus is not a standing pose, you may still consider exploring variations of the pose standing. While it's considered a progressed position, since less of your body is touching the floor, it may be an easier position for mapping certain movements in other ways. Consider the additional resources you have to regress movements in the standing positions, like a wall or a chair or a dowel. These are all ways that you can kind of close chains between your hands and the floor, give yourself more stability. And when exploring changes in lever length, balance, and range of motion, additional support in this way can be useful. Okay, so for example, in this class, going to the wall, placing hands on the wall. Okay. So again, these reflect the other strategies that we have in terms of regress and progress. Like what happens if you close more chains? That could be hands on the wall, hands on dowels, hands on chair, both feet on the floor. What happens if you start to open chains and have to support yourself more without that stability? What happens if you try it with shorter levers, longer levers, or potentially progress or regress the base of support with stability? The final section here offers the invitation. Again, depends on the level of class. Maybe the pose you're working on is an inverted pose. Maybe it's not. You know, whether or not you choose to teach all these sections, having sort of a well-rounded further inventory of how this pose might show up in other orientations to gravity, to the earth, can be useful. So, you know, I would say, like, what might Warrior 3 look like, if that was the pose? What might Warrior 3 look like if it was done inverted? Right, so I'm aware, like, when I typically go up into a handstand, I will often start in Warrior 3, and then I'll put my hands on the floor, and then it's that sort of split leg momentum, or that push and pull that swings my pelvis up, okay, and then my legs can come together. If I was to regress that position and provide kind of closed chain support, that might look like L pose at the wall, right, with one leg up. Okay, so Warrior 3 with the standing leg against the wall, hands on the floor, becomes an inverted version of that pose as well. Okay. So how might you use the wall? How might you use a chair? Other ideas, etc. And then finally, you know, in reference to the cool down, much like the considerations that you might make about the beginning of your class, I'd say you might have sort of a standard kind of cool down sequence or finishing pose sequence that you like to practice after your movement practice, and that's all fine and good. You'll notice in this particular class, we only do one pose. That's a quote unquote cool down pose or a counter pose, and that was standing figure 4. So I was aware that the majority of work that we were doing in this class was focused in the outer hip, primarily the glutes, glute med, glute min, glute max. And so it made like most sense kind of from an efficiency standpoint to give you kind of a stretch for those muscles, and then, you know, thanks for class and be on your way. If I had had more time, if there was, you know, if we'd explored more movements, you know, certainly there could be a longer, more elaborate cool down section. But I want to be aware of kind of the cool downs that are just part of what I'm familiar with, or maybe what I just sort of push play on and always do, and what's actually needed or what's actually useful to help sort of mitigate the buildup of that residual tension in the musculature and the tissues as a result of class. So I say, while a full body cool down can be nice after a movement practice, consider what would be needed to facilitate balance. As your sequence likely explores specific loaded joint positions, consider deloading these positions by moving in the opposite direction. This is one area where passive stretching can play a useful role in the mitigation of residual tension from practice. So once we've done a lot of loading of these tissues and activation, it can be nice to deload the tissues and give yourself some more passive release on the downward arc of class. So the joint positions and the muscles that have been loaded in this particular practice were, let's say, the outer hip, glute muscles, positions to then deload. In this case was figure 4 stretch, to stretch the glutes. Then final note here, when crafting your sequence, select the regressions and progressions that apply to your specific goals. So you might go through this worksheet, kind of fill out all these different ideas, but then, you know, it's a good problem to have. You're going to have more poses, more movements than you'll have time to teach. So like, what really applies to your specific goals of what you're going for? It's not necessary or possible that every variation and every position be explored. Really, the type of class, the level of student, the objectives are the determining factors. This template is to provide a starting point and basic outline for crafting your class, but experiment and be willing to adapt its format to meet your needs and to meet your interests. And I'll say, you know, with all the classes that I teach, especially on YI, it's an interesting thing because, you know, you offer the class, but there's no students there to take the class to really get the feedback. And then in many instances, the class is released several months, sometimes even as much as a year down the road, and then people take the class. So, you know, you might not really get the feedback on if it was effective until, in this case, you know, when did I record this class? Last May. So it's been about a year since I recorded this class, and now I'm finally able to kind of get feedback on it. So, you know, there's always that kind of that feedback loop, whether it's immediate, whether it's a bit more extended, that can further kind of give you ideas about like what is needed, what maybe wasn't needed, what was effective. And that's an ongoing, you know, for the yoga nerds out there, for us yoga nerds, like that's the ongoing invitation, right? The sequence doesn't need to be perfect. The sequence is an opportunity to explore something and then to ask more questions, both of your students, of yourself, of your understanding of movement, of yoga. And as is always the case, if I was to film this class again today, even just based on the conversation we've just had, albeit a somewhat one-sided conversation, but based on you know, the process that I've undergone, even trying to dissect and analyze my choices, the class would be different. So it's one of the things I love most about teaching is that there's this recursive element of like doing the same thing over and over again. But if you're willing to explore variations within that template, within that format, there really is no opportunity to be bored. Certainly what I've learned about regressions and progressions has unlocked not just my I guess, strategies for intelligent sequencing, but also my creativity, right? A pose or a shape as seemingly simple as Virabhadrasana 3 can be explored in so many different ways, and there really is no limit to what you can unpack there. So again, I want to shout out and thank my friend Trina, who initially introduced me to this particular work. You know, all of you that have chosen to participate in this, not just this class, but this training, to further my own understanding, right? The teaching is an extension of one's studentship, and we get to learn together by continuing to ask these questions. So with that said, I'm going to kind of segue into maybe 20 minutes or so of Q&A. I'm sure you guys have plenty of questions. Thank you for staying up late, those of you that are in different time zones here. So in terms of homework, tomorrow we're going to meet at 9 a.m. Pacific. There's 2 sessions tomorrow, one from 9 to 11, and the second is from 1 to 3. The class that we're going to look at tomorrow is the isometrics class, one of the isometrics class, specifically the first one that's on chaturanga or push-ups. It's the isometric push class, and we'll be exploring some principles relative to that. So before you tune in tomorrow, make sure to take that class. It's only 20 minutes. The second class we'll be looking at is the Rise Up Backbend class that I taught on Easter. That class is a little longer, it's an hour. So if you want to take that class before, you can take it before, or you can take it in between the 2 sessions. You'll have 2 hours free in between. Some optional homework for you guys if you want to you know, continue kind of investigating in this work, would be to go back to the sequence. There's a sequencing PDF for all the classes that I'm teaching in this series. So there's a sequencing PDF for the single leg stability class with images of the sequence. Take a look at that, and in light of what we've talked about, see if you can make some notes and identify the different progression strategies that I've implemented in that sequence, and just see if it makes a little bit more sense, kind of where my mind was at in crafting that sequence based on what we've talked about here. The last thing I'll invite for anyone that's feeling overambitious, if you want to craft a sequence using these templates, I'll give you the pose, the invitation to explore the pose Garudasana, which is eagle pose. So if you want to apply this knowledge to the mapping of a progression to Garudasana, feel free to do so. And if you upload it into the Facebook group, I will take a look at your sequence and happy to offer some feedback in the coming days. Okay, that's probably enough to keep you busy for the next however many hours before we meet. Thank you guys so much. I'll say goodbye to a good portion of you, and if you want to stick around and chat with me for 20 minutes or so here, I'm happy to do so. Thank you very much. Peace. Very good. I'm glad you guys got some good info out of that. You know, it's always, oh, thank you, Trina. It's always difficult to teach without having, you know, face-to-face contact with folks to see your heads nodding or your faces going like this. So I'm glad you guys got some good information here. Yeah, good. Minds are likely to spin. All right, I'm going to open the Q&A box and see what is in here. So some open questions. There's 13 answered questions. I guess I must have covered it along the way. Okay, so question 1, this is from Jen Wooten. Is that correct? Does progressive regressive also relate to functional movement and specialized movement? Yeah, so movement regressions and progressions are not relative to any particular style of movement. Really, it's a principle, a concept of exercise science. You know, if you were to work with a personal trainer or work with a movement specialist and you wanted to develop a skill, they would need to regress the movement and offer it to you in a way that you could map and learn that skill. And really it applies to everything. Like if you're a dancer and you want to learn some choreography, the regression might just look like slowing it way down. You slow it down and you do a little piece of it, and then repeat it and speed it up, and then slow it down and then refine it and move on to the next piece. So, you know, it's just referencing all of the different ways that you can make something more accessible and help to effectively map a skill in one's body. And then once that skill is there, you know, how you can likewise progress and make it more challenging. So yes, movement regression and progression applies to all movement independent of the modality. You might have different language, you know, you might hear teachers present it in different ways, but the principle is it's also inherent to life itself, right? We were born in a pretty regressed position, lying on the floor. I mean, we're not born on the floor, but you put a baby on the floor and there's not much they can do. So it's the desire to get up off the ground and to explore our environment that awakens that impulse within us to progress. What makes the yogi unique, I think, and not just the yogi, but anyone that engages in a movement practice, is that instead of just kind of letting life inspire us to progress, we kind of get in there and we decide to participate consciously in our own evolution. Everything is always evolving, but when we participate in our evolution, that's when things can get pretty interesting. Example from the class that was extrinsic. There wasn't, because we weren't really working with extrinsic load in this particular class, there really aren't any examples. You know, if I had like some ankle weights and I said like, now we're gonna do the hip circumductions or do the transition with a ankle weight, that would be an example of extrinsic load. Okay, or if we had a kettlebell in your hands as we were doing some of the movements. Can intrinsic load be an isometric action? Yes, that's kind of precisely what it often is, right? So putting your knee on the block in the beginning of class, right, is essentially a regression. The block is supporting you there. Telling you to push your knee into the block then increases the intrinsic load in your hip. So oftentimes, you know, it's like, sometimes I'll teach classes and students will say things like, oh, I had no idea that I was doing that pose wrong all this time because there was clearly so much more I could be doing. And I usually say to them, you weren't doing it wrong. We just progressed the intrinsic load. If you ever practice Iyengar yoga, you know, they'll put you in a pose like Trikonasana and you never knew how much you could be doing in Trikonasana until you got to an Iyengar class. So it's not to suggest that that's what you should always do, or that's the right way to do it, or that's the only way to do it. That's a progression of intrinsic load. So typically what we think of as isometrics or isometric engagement, certainly with what we call MVC, which we'll talk about tomorrow, as sort of maximizing the contraction, is a progression that helps to increase our strength. do you think it's better to teach a different sequence to students every time or lead them through the same practice for familiarity? It depends on what you mean by every time. So, if it's like a split where I say, this particular class that we did today, if you were to do this class every Monday for a month, that could be a good thing, right? If it was, let's do this class every day for a month, that'd probably be too much. And it's not so much that this class would not be of benefit, it's that you would be doing it at the exclusion of other things. So my sentiment on repetition is not so much that the repetition is bad, it's just that usually when you repeat something, you're not doing other things. So the way that I typically work out in the course of a 4 to 6 week span is usually with a split. So I might repeat the same practice or the same type of practice once a week, but then there's variability on the other days as well. So I think there's a way that you can do both. You can repeat, but it's not the only thing you do. It's like when people ask me, what type of yoga is your favorite? I'm equal opportunity. I think that there's benefit in all styles of movement, and there's also a shared detriment in all styles of movement, where if it's the only thing that you do, it can over time, contribute to not just wear and tear, but a lack of diversity in one's movement. Okay, can we go more into why the toes of the standing leg turned in on Ardha Chandrasana and how to give feedback and modification for this? So something that tends to happen in the hip joint when you move into flexion is our hips can internally rotate. I want to say this in a way that might make sense without giving you too deep of a rabbit hole. Essentially, how to give feedback and modification for this, that's what we do in the class. So in the class, when I have your leg here, and I ask you to bend your knee and press your knee and your hand together, I think at one point you do it with a block. It's this stabilization of the outer hip that needs to stay recruited as you progress off of 2 legs onto 1 leg. Okay. What tends to happen for folks, because this is a pretty deep level of external rotation and abduction, as you tip forward into that leg, if you maybe lack the strength to stabilize that position, our body just tends to compensate a bit and turn the leg in and put you here. And just to be really clear, there's nothing wrong with that. And just in terms of like the safety of your hip, I would rather, I'll show you from this front angle, if someone doesn't have this much rotation in their hip, I would rather somebody do this, I'd rather somebody go there than someone do that, right? So I think it's a strategy, because the hip is trying to move kind of out of that deep range. It's just a strategy to get the whole chain to turn and come up this way. Now, that's not to suggest that you just shouldn't care about it. If it's something you want to work on, then essentially the class that I sequenced helps to address that. And it does so by kind of creating a partially closed chain on the outer knee so that you can maintain the hip in that position as you kind of move into and out of the shape. But the reason that it tends to turn in a little bit, I think, is just that it's an easier position to not just stabilize the hip, but to kind of stabilize our full body weight out of that kind of extreme end range of external rotation. And if we're thinking about function, I can't really think of a time in life where you would need to stand on one leg with it like maximally rotated externally like this. Typically we would kind of turn the leg in a little bit. If you wanted to pick up something over there, you wouldn't turn your leg all the way out to do it, right? You might turn it out a little bit and then go over here and grab something. So, that would look like that. So it's a functional position to turn the foot in a little bit. It's just not like the proper alignment of the pose. So all those different feedback strategies can be useful. Slowing it down, regressing the load, using a chair, different ways to help support somebody to be able to do that well. Hope that helps. Quick question, in Warrior 3, do you keep your standing leg in a micro bend for stability or otherwise? With various injuries, at least for me, it certainly helps. Yeah, so a micro bend is going to shorten the lever a little bit. And typically with a shortened lever, you're gonna have greater access to different kind of vectors of force. So like if my leg is all the way, let's say it this way, if my leg is all the way straight and I want to create activation of the outer hip, I sort of have to create that by twisting my foot. Like I gotta twist this whole long lever has to twist to create stability here. As soon as I bend my knee, I can create the stability by twisting. I can also create the stability by pushing my knee into my hand, right? So now I have two kind of levers. I have this lever and I have this lever. So I have a different points of contact to create that movement. That's why in this class, before we went into a straight leg version of these poses, we started with the knees bent so that you could push, create the activation, and then progress the joint position once the muscles were already activated. So I tend to think with things like microbends, the microbend is a good first step to get the activation to happen, and then you can slowly decrease the microbend or progress the range of motion, you know, with the caveat that if you start to lose the activation, then you've gone too far, right? So just kind of saying like, always keep a microbend is sort of half of the story for me. Keep a microbend so that you can more effectively engage or stabilize, and then, you know, decrease or progress the microbend depending on if you can maintain the activation. But it also does, you know, depending on how much range of motion you have in your knee. For a lot of folks, you know, if your knee can go into like what we call a hyperextension or go past neutral, the microbend is also sort of a strategy just to make sure that you don't go kind of past the point at which you can maintain stability in the knee and in the hip. I missed your description of lever length. How far away from the joint? Oh, so lever length refers to how far away from the joint the weight is essentially distributed. Okay, so again, if my arm weighs whatever it weighs, but my shoulder is going to experience the force of my arm less if the lever is short versus if the lever is long. So if my hand is further away from my shoulder, there's going to be more force in my shoulder than if my hand is close to my shoulder, if the lever is shorter. So how far away from the focal joint the weight is distributed is going to determine the length of the lever. Sorry for forgetting. How do you explain the movement of the pelvis from Warrior 3 to Half Moon in anatomical terms again? I'm constantly working on learning. Yeah, okay, good question. So describing the movement of the pelvis in general is kind of difficult because when we talk about joints, we're talking about two bones that come together. So the movement of the joint is really relative to how these two bones are interfacing with each other. When we talk about the movement of the pelvis, we're often talking about its position in space, which isn't really relative to anything. And so it can be difficult to get clarity on what the pelvis is doing when we're not referencing it or when it's not relative to another bone. So I'll give you a little example here. So technically, what's happening in your hips, if I go from, let's say, this position to this position, and this is really what this class explored, the common misconception, I think, is that we tend to think that from this position to this position, what's happening is that this hip, this top hip, is rolling on top of this hip. And to a certain extent, that's true. But if I look at the joint position that's changing, there's really nothing that's changing in this joint. There's a lot that's changing in this joint. So this joint is actually going from a flex position into an abducted position. It's why we started on our backs, going from flex to abducted. So I tend to think of this movement less as this hip lifting on top of this hip, and more as this hip sort of squeezing underneath this hip. And I think that's one of the things, one of the understandings that helps to mitigate the possible damage in that hip joint, because instead of kind of grinding your top hip on top of the bottom, you're sort of stabilizing and supporting the bottom hip moving under the pelvis. So in terms of the hip positions, this would be extended, this would be flexed, and then when I go into this position, all that changes is that this hip becomes abducted. And because now this hip is changing its orientation to gravity, whereas before I was lifting it up against gravity this way, now I'm lifting it up against gravity this way, I'm essentially going from extension flexion into abduction, abduction. So it's really more a change in the hip joint. It's not so much a change in the pelvis. In doing so, you'll see in the sequence, I talk about proximal movement and distal movement. And proximal movement, how I use that is to refer to the more proximal structure, which would be like anything closer in proximity to your trunk, spine, pelvis, moving, versus the more distal structures moving. So if it was a distal movement, I would move my hip from flexion into abduction. This would be a distal movement of my hip. Okay? If it were, let's do this one. Okay? So this would be more distal. My leg is moving relative to my pelvis. If it's a proximal movement and that chain is closed, now my pelvis is moving relative to my leg. It's the same movement, right? But oriented differently. So that's part one. When we talk about movements in the pelvis, we have what's called an anterior or a posterior pelvic tilt. We have what's called a lateral tip of the pelvis, this way, and then we have rotation in the pelvis. And all those movements essentially just create respective movements in the hip. Anterior, posterior tends to create flexion, extension, lateral pelvic movements tends to create adduction and abduction, and rotation tends to create rotation of the hip joint. So when I go from this position to this position, you could say it's a pelvic rotation. It's a pelvic rotation that creates hip abduction and external rotation. Clear as mud? The difference between a partially closed chain and a closed chain. Yeah, so a closed chain would be distributing my force into the floor or into the earth. Partially closed chain is in reference to kind of distributing force into something that's not let's say this another way. Closed chain would be touching or connecting my force to a fixed object. And what would make an object fixed would be that it's ultimately connected to the earth. Partially closed chain would be connecting my force to a non-fixed object. So for example, this would be closed chain in my hands, okay? This would be partially closed chain in my hands. It's somewhat semantics. You'll hear people refer to both as closed chain, just sort of the technical definition. Are your warm-ups usually just regressions of the pose you're sequencing around? Also, how long do you suggest we should cool down or stretch? So the first question, yeah, it depends to a certain extent, but like if let's say my intention is to strengthen my hip joint, or I'm gonna work out and work on like push-ups or something, typically, I wouldn't say it's a regression in that I'm like just doing push-up regressions, but like, I'll kind of do some like dynamic movements to increase range of motion in that joint, which to a certain extent is a regression. Oftentimes with warm-ups, I'll do things more dynamically or even kind of ballistically, just kind of create mobility in the joint. Because if you're wanting to load a particular joint and strengthen that joint, you can only typically load or strengthen areas that you have access to. So I will sometimes do passive stretching, or I'll do things to increase range of motion so that then I can strengthen and load those ranges of motion in my in my practice, in my movement practice. So it just depends. If the warm up is more mental, sometimes my warm up looks like a brief meditation, or it might look like sun salutations, just something to get me in my body. Sometimes I'll even just like warm up myself by bringing some circulation and blood flow to my body. So, warm-ups don't have to necessarily look like that, but in terms of the sequencing, if I'm really going after something directly, like I do in this class, I'm more inclined to choose warm-ups that are regressions of the pose. So it kind of just depends on the intention. How long? I don't have a recommendation for the amount of time. It depends on how much stuff you did. So if you strengthened everything, if you like a full spectrum practice where you strengthen your shoulders and your core and your spine and everything, it's going to probably take more time to counter stretch. If you were just doing one thing or working on one area, it won't take that much time to counter stretch. So that would definitely depend on what you did, how much work you did there, and what you mean by cool down. Like, this class didn't use a Shavasana. Certainly Shavasana can be useful. So oftentimes I like to stretch. I like restorative practices. I like the kind of more yin practices. So the amount of time is often dependent on how much time I have. Okay, how would you suggest to apply your chosen focus if you were applying your principles to this transition in a class, adding Vira 3 to half moon? 3 and chose to now transition to half moon. If I'm being honest, I don't quite understand the question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Don't quite understand the question, but I will say, the more poses that you add into the, the question is, how would you suggest applying your chosen focus if you were applying your principles to this transition in a class, adding Vira 3 to half moon? If I was in Garudasana and added Vira 3 and chose to now transition to half moon without being able to focus a class on this skill? That's the question I am a little less clear on. I think maybe what I hear you asking is, like, if you weren't going to do a class like this where you really build this skill, how could you still incorporate that into a class? So I would say, and if you notice in the class that I teach, we don't actually go from like full Vira 3 to Ardha Chandrasana. I do some things to regress that. Like we bend the back knee, we put our hands on blocks. So those are all regression strategies, right? I'm shortening the lever, I'm closing the chain on my hands, even bend the standing leg a little bit. So, if I was going to teach a vinyasa class tomorrow and incorporate these movements, what's nice about vinyasa is you have repetition. So you could use the first round of a vinyasa class, to do a more regressed version and to add some feedback and all this. And you can slow things down. You can have people put their hands on blocks, and then with each repetition of the sequence, you could choose to progress an aspect of it. So, like, if you were able to do this with your hands on the blocks, if you were able to, keep your outer hip engaged, the next time we go through the sequence, try lifting one hand or try keeping your back leg straight. Whenever I encourage students to progress a movement, I want to make them also clear on what it is we're going for. So it's not just if you can keep your hands off the blocks, it's really if you can keep your outer hip engaged and take your hands off the blocks and take your hand off your knee, then do that. So, teaching vinyasa is complicated because you have to kind of find ways to thread some of these skills into the class without necessarily always pausing and really investing in them, which is why, I take advantage of the opportunity to teach a class that fully dives into this skill. So, if I had a student that had a hard time with that, I could say, hey, check out that class I have online that's going to really break down how to do this so that when you go to your vinyasa practice, you'll have a little bit more, not just understanding, but you'll have a little bit more strength and ability to manage that. How about for hyperextension in the knees? I think I addressed that earlier. You know, it's the hyperextension in the knee is not so much an issue for me. It's that when the leg is that straight, it might inhibit some of the ability to engage the structures that would otherwise stabilize the leg. So a little bend in the knee just gives you more kind of fulcrum points to then create activation. You know, knee hyperextension is not the enemy that it's made out to be. It's just that typically when we go past straight into like hyper straight, that tends to be at the expense of like the engagement of the hamstrings and the calf muscles and muscles that we might otherwise want engaged. I mean, as we saw in Warrior 3, that is sort of a variation of a deadlift, which would be a hamstring strengthening exercise. So if you were to make that movement dynamic, go up and down, you would probably find that that your knee being all the way straight or hyper straight wouldn't really allow you to map that movement. And so you probably want to keep your knee a little bit bent, much like in a Romanian deadlift or something, so that you can maintain strength in the back of your leg. How much time do you typically dedicate to sequencing a class? That really depends. I've made, you know, one of the reasons I share about the regressions and progressions as well is because once you understand these principles and once you practice them over and over again, you know, you could conceivably sequence a class without even thinking of it, you know, without even writing it down. You know, if it's, you know, one time in a teacher training, I taught this class, or I taught a version of this class. This will either allure you to doing a training with me or scare you from it, but I taught a version of this class that was 3 hours long, you know, where we just like really dove into all the different regressions and skills. And, you know, it wasn't like 3 hours of constant movement, but, you know, we brought out the dowels and the chairs and we played with this movement pattern in as many different ways as we could. And because I just incrementally progressed the skills, you know, it was able to be a pretty long class, but an effective class at really exploring this particular movement. And that wasn't a class that I even really planned, because I just kind of went incrementally through like, well, what would this look like on the floor? What would it look like if we fix this object and move this object? What if we, by object I mean your body, if we fix this part of your body and move this part of your body? What if we did short lever, long lever? What if we tried it on our hands and knees? And so it kind of built from there. In fact, this class that I taught on YI was sort of the condensed 45-minute version of that longer class. And I'll say it actually took me longer to sequence this class than it did to do that 3-hour version, because the 3-hour version was sort of like a workshop where we just got to play. And the shorter version, that's when I had to kind of boundary it and say, okay, what is, you know, what's the most relevant pieces of the sequence to insert here? So it really depends. If I'm putting together like a vinyasa sequence that is new, there's sort of a choreography component there that can get complex, and it can take me a long time. I'm a yoga nerd, so like, and I'm a Virgo, so like I can spend a lot of time in a sequence, kind of obsessing about every little piece of the sequence, and then at a certain point, I'll say, okay, it's got to be done. I'm just going to teach it as it is. And then other times, I could put something together in 5 minutes. So it depends on how much are pieces I've taught before and how much of it are things I'm trying for the first time. What I recommend, though, I will say, you know, if you find yourself having a difficult time with time management, give yourself the challenge of saying, like, I have 10 minutes to plan this class. And, you know, I'm going to use the first ideas that come to mind. And after 10 minutes, I'm going to say I'm done. And then I'm going to move on to another class and see if you can see what you can do in 10 minutes. In many instances, what I can plan in a 10-minute class is actually better than if I was to spend 3 hours kind of obsessing over a sequence. So I try to give myself little challenges based on how much time I have to you know, introduce that contextual interference in my planning process. So it doesn't always take the same amount of time. How much can I deadlift? I don't know. I haven't I haven't deadlifted like weight in a while. Right now I work with resistance bands. So all the deadlifting I'm doing is with like pull-up bands over there somewhere, like the kind of big loop pull-up bands. So depending on where you grab the weight, depending on any number of factors, it's different. Like typically when I work out though, I don't go for like the heaviest weight possible. I'm much more interested in isometric actions so that I can create a lot of intrinsic load with not a lot of extrinsic weight. It's my yoga training. So when I was at the gym last deadlifting, I usually deadlift around like 100 pounds. That's kind of all I need to get the amount of resistance that I am looking for. But I don't know about like my 2 or 3 rep max, what it would be. I'll let you know. Okay, we did it, guys. Session 1, learning curves and all. Thank you so much for being here. These are actually not my cats. I'm house sitting this place for some friends, but the black cat is Gucci and the other one is Raph, and they are total complete ding dongs, and I'm a little bit obsessed with them. I'm sure they'll make an appearance throughout the weekend. Okay, I think that is it. Let's see, I meant to log out and then back on so people, okay. All right, lots of love, you guys. Thank you for your time, for your attention, and I'll see you tomorrow in the morning for me and whatever that might be for you all. Peace out.